Hi guys, I'm Steven from Redshift Sports, and I just wanted to shoot a quick video to give you guys an idea of what to expect when you guys receive your shock stops, and also give you a few quick tips about installation and how to get the shock stop properly installed on your bike. So when you get your shock stop, it'll come in a beautiful box like this. You'll pop this open and slide out the sleeve inside, which will have the stem in it. It'll also have a couple of the extra elastomers which allow you to tune the suspension stiffness and the instructions. One thing that's important to note is that the shock stop is compatible with standard drop bar road handlebars as well as flat hybrid or mountain bike handlebars. It's not compatible with swept back style cruiser handlebars or any bars that have substantial rearward sweep to them. So I'm going to run through this. Keep in mind that I'm running through this for a standard threadless steer stem. Shock stop is compatible with bicycles that have standard 1 1/8 inch steerer tubes. If your bicycle has a different steerer tube size, it may or may not be compatible using a shim. If you have a quill stem, you're going to need an adapter, and that's something that we're not going to cover in this video. So the first is to take your existing stem off of your bike. So the first thing to do is just to loosen the faceplate bolts and remove those, and take the handlebar out of the faceplate. Already loosened these a little bit to make this easier. Try not to drop any of these bolts. Always makes things a little bit easier. And just gently put your handlebar down. You can usually just rest it on the front tire or let it hang next to your bike. So the next step, before you actually remove the stem, your existing stem, take note of the orientation of your stem. So if you have a plus or minus 6 degree shock stop, you're going to want to install it probably in the same orientation, the plus or minus orientation, depending on how you have your stem installed. You're also going to want to note if you have any headset spacers here above or below the stem. The stack height of the shock stop on the steerer tube is very similar to standard stems, so in most cases you're just going to want to reinstall those spacers in the same orientation that you had them with your existing stem. So just go ahead and loosen the pinch bolts here for the steerer tube clamp. Don't need to take these all the way out, you can just loosen them. And then go ahead and remove the steer tube cap here. Take this bolt all the way out. And at this point you should be able to remove your stem from your bicycle's steer tube. You may have to twist it a little bit. You should be able to pull up and take it off. So to install the new shock stop, basically you want to choose the correct orientation. So there's a plus and a minus orientation for the 6 degree version. For the plus 30 degree version, it can only be installed in the plus 30 degree orientation, the upright orientation. But for the plus 6 degree, it can be installed in either orientation. So based on what you noted from your existing stem installation, choose either the plus or the minus 6. And the way you can tell is basically if you hold the steer tube clamp, completely vertically, in the plus 6 degree orientation, the stem will be oriented slightly upward, and in the minus 6 degree orientation, it'll be oriented slightly downward. So I'm going to go ahead and install mine in the minus 6 degree orientation. At this point, you don't need to worry about the orientation of the elastomers inside here yet. We're going to get the stem installed on the bike first, and then we're going to worry about the orientation of the elastomers and swapping those out based on my weight. So to do this, take a 4mm Allen wrench and loosen the 2 pinch bolts. We're going to slide this down onto the steerer. You may have to wiggle it a little bit. Should slide smoothly on there. And just get it roughly lined up with the front wheel at this point. You may want to just lightly snug down these bolts. Do not tighten the pinch bolts yet. We're going to do that a little bit later. And then go ahead and reinstall your steer tube cap with any spacers that you took off before installing the new shock stop. It's important to note here, if for some reason the shock stop, the top of the shock stop steer tube clamp does not extend above the top of your steer tube, you may need to add a spacer underneath the shock stop. Basically, you want the top of the shock stop steer tube clamp to be just a couple of millimeters above the top of the steer tube. So I'm going to go ahead and reinstall this. And again, I'm just going to lightly snug this down. I'm not going to tighten it just yet. Okay, now using a 4mm Allen wrench, I'm going to go ahead and remove these faceplate bolts. Just take all 4 of them out. And here you can see that the elastomers, when their stem ships to you, are actually installed, assuming that you're going to install the stem in the +6 degree orientation. Since I've installed my stem in the -6 degree orientation, I'm going to show you how to take the elastomers out and swap them to the correct orientation for the -6 degree orientation, and also how you would swap elastomers if you were just swapping them to adjust the stiffness. So for this, you're going to need a 3mm Allen wrench. And inside of the stem, you'll see a plastic preload wedge, as well as the 2 colored elastomers. There's a bolt in the center of that preload wedge that you're going to need to loosen. So to loosen this, you're just going to insert the long end of the wrench and turn this counterclockwise. If you have any difficulty breaking this torque with a standard Allen wrench, one kind of trick that you can use is you can take the faceplate of the stem and you can actually just place it over the end of the Allen wrench and use that to give you a little bit of extra leverage on the short end of the Allen wrench, just to get that broken, that torque broken. And once you've done that, you're going to turn this bolt all the way out. And unfortunately, this does require quite a few turns to get out. You're basically going to completely remove this preload wedge. It's going to require about 30 turns, 30 full turns to remove. So just take your time doing this. If you happen to have a torque wrench with a ratchet, it's always a nice time to use that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. But otherwise, you're just going to continue turning until the bolt comes all the way out. And once it's loose, you can pull the preload wedge out and put it to the side. Now to remove the 2 elastomers, you can just pull the stem, push the stem actually in this orientation, push the stem downward slightly, and you can use the short end of the Allen wrench here to hook the little handle on the elastomer and just pull each one out. So the shock stop will come shipped with a 70 and an 80 elastomer in them. There's a guide in the instructions that kind of gives you some guidelines based on your weight and the type of bike that you're riding. If you're riding a drop bar road bike, you're going to want to use 2 elastomers, 1 on each side. If you're riding a flat bar bike, like a hybrid or a mountain bike, you're actually probably only going to use 1 elastomer in one of the 2 pockets in there. Once you start riding with the elastomers, you may actually notice that the elastomers soften up a little bit during the first ride or 2. What's happening is basically the elastomers squeeze into shape and settle in a little bit. And what that does is it softens them effectively a little bit. So what we recommend is that if you have started riding and you feel like the stem may be a little bit too stiff, give it a ride or 2 and then decide based on that whether you want to switch to a different set of elastomers to go up or down. So I'm just going to go ahead and reinstall this elastomer combination. The thing to note is that you always want the elastomers to be installed on the top side of the stem. So inside of the stem there's a cross basically, and the elastomers can be installed on either side of that cross So if you have the stem installed in the -6 orientation, you're just going to want to make sure that the elastomers are installed on the top side of the cross. And likewise, if you flip the stem over to install it in the +6 orientation, you're going to need to take the elastomers out and move them back to the top side of the cross so that they're always on the top. The other thing to note is that since the elastomers have a little handle on them, you want the handles to be facing towards the outsides of the stem, so close to the walls of the stem basically. And that's just so the preload wedge doesn't interfere with those little rubber handles as you're installing the preload wedge. So I'm going to go ahead and tuck these in here. You can just lift the stem all the way to the top and just drop these in and push them all the way in until they're fully seated. And at this point, I'm going to reinstall the preload wedge. So it's really important here that you have the stem installed on your bike before you reinstall the preload wedge. And the reason for that is because you need to apply a little bit of downward pressure on the stem in order to get the preload wedge bolt started into the threads inside the stem. If you don't do this, if you do this with the stem off of the bicycle, it's possible to cross thread that thread and actually damage the female thread, which can render the stem unusable. So just make sure you do this on the bike so that you can apply a little bit of downward pressure. So essentially you're gonna take your Allen wrench, insert it into the bolt head, and just slide this in. You're gonna line up the bolt with the threaded hole inside, and essentially you need to have the bolt kind of near the bottom of the slot in the preload wedge. So kind of as low as the head of the bolt as low as possible. So once you've gotten that there, you're going to just apply a little bit of downward pressure. You don't need a ton of downward pressure, just a little bit, and then start threading this in. And you should feel it catch. If you feel any strong resistance immediately, especially while applying this downward pressure, just stop and make sure that everything's lined up. You shouldn't really be feeling much resistance to turning the bolt, especially as you're applying this downward pressure on the stem. And once you have it in a few turns, you can release the downward pressure and just go ahead and turn this in. So similar to removal, you're going to have to go through about those 30 turns, full turns, to get this fully seated. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my ratcheting torque wrench to make this a little bit faster. And as you're turning this in, you may actually start to notice that the force required to turn it in increases gradually. That's because basically as we're driving this preload wedge inward, it's essentially preloading the elastomers. It's compressing them slightly against the top of the stem. And what that does is it takes all the play out of the stem, so it doesn't feel sloppy while you're riding. Okay, and once you start to feel the resistance increase, basically you'll realize that you've reached the bottom. So at this point you want to torque this bolt to between 1.5 and 2.5 Newton meters with a torque wrench. I have the torque wrench set here, so I'm going to go ahead and finish torquing this. Okay, torque wrench just clicked. If you don't have a torque wrench handy, or if you don't have a bit that can reach this bolt inside this stem, 1.5 to 2.5 Newton meters is generally about as tight as you can tighten by hand with the short end of the Allen wrench. So if I'm holding the short end of the Allen wrench, 1.5 to 2.5 Newton meters is approximately as tight as I can get this by hand. All right, so now the preload bolt is completely installed. The preload wedge is installed. You can see that there's no more play in the stem. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the handlebar onto the bike. So I'm just going to line this up. And I'm going to just slide the faceplate under the cables here. And get each of these bolts threaded in a little bit. And I'm going to make sure my handlebar is centered and that the angle of the handlebars is where I want it. And then I'm just going to snug these down. I'm not going to torque them to the final torque yet. And it's important to make sure that the gap, basically the gap between the faceplate and the stem, on both the top and the bottom of the stem is approximately equal. You don't want the, one side to be totally bottomed out and the other side have a big gap. You want the gaps to be approximately equal to one another. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and just lightly snug each of these. And then using my torque wrench, I'm going to torque these to the final torque of 5 Newton meters. And I'm going to do this in a star pattern. I'm basically going to go, from top to bottom and then across diagonally. I'm not going to tighten one bolt immediately to the final torque. I'm just going to gradually give each of these, about a half turn in that star pattern I was talking about. And torque them up gradually. Okay, so everything's torqued up there, so I'm all set. One other note, I've shown this stem installed on a handlebar that is 31.8 millimeters in diameter, which is sort of the standard modern road bike or hybrid or mountain bike standard. But there are bikes, a lot of bikes that have handlebars that are other diameters, specifically 25.4 millimeters and 26.0 millimeters. So if you have a slightly older road bike, it likely has a 26.0 millimeter handlebar. If you have a slightly older mountain bike, or if you have a hybrid bike, it may have a 25.4 millimeter handlebar. You can usually find out what diameter the bar is by removing the faceplate. It's often printed somewhere on the bar. Or you can take your bike to your local bike shop to have it measured. If you specified in your survey results, we included shims for either 25.4 or 26.0 or both. And so you're just going to want to use the appropriate shims to install the handlebar into the faceplate. And basically you're just going to take the two shims and wrap them around the handlebar in the clamping area, and then insert the shimmed portion into the faceplate before you bolt it down. One thing you want to make sure you do is just to align the gap of the two shims with the gap in the faceplate, between the faceplate and the stem, so that the faceplate's clamping pressure basically clamps the two shims together. Then the last step is just to go ahead and tighten the steer tube clamp here. So here what you want to do is just make sure that your stem is lined up with your front wheel the way you want it. And then you're going to lightly snug down this bolt. So you don't want to apply a lot of pressure, just enough to take up any of the play. And then basically you're going to tighten these two pinch bolts down. And again, the torque spec here is 5 Newton meters. So you can use the same torque wrench setting that you just had. And at this point, you're all set. You're ready to ride. I'm also going to quickly show you guys the ShockStop utility mount and computer mount. So these install basically by removing two of the faceplate bolts and installing the mount, and then replacing those two faceplate bolts with longer bolts that are included with the mounts. So why don't we go over that quickly. So the utility mount can be used to mount bike computers, bike lights, bells, anything you would normally mount on a handlebar can generally be mounted to the utility mount. For the utility mount, there are actually 4 different orientations that you can install it in, because you can install it either in the upper or lower bolts, but you can also flip it upside down. So the highest position is to flip it like this and then install it on the upper bolts. You can also flip it like this and install it in the upper bolts, and those same 2 positions for the lower bolts. So you have 4 options, and that really lets you tune exactly where you want your accessories to sit basically when you have them installed. Obviously, you're going to need to pay attention a little bit to how your cables run. When you're installing this, after you install it, just make sure that you check and make sure that you can move your handlebar side to side and that the cables don't catch. or stretch on anything, you want to make sure that obviously they're not compromising your steering. So you may need to actually install these with the cables pushed down below or above, depending on how tight your cable runs are and exactly what the geometry is. The computer mount is similar. It installs by replacing 2 of the faceplate bolts. It's specific though to a particular type of computer, so when you ordered it you should have specified basically whether you had a Garmin computer or a Cat-Eye computer, etc. For the computer mount, there are 2 different locations you can mount the computer mount. You can mount it either to the lower set of bolts, which will provide a little bit more of a, a streamlined aerodynamic position for your bike computer, or you can install it to the upper 2 sets of bolts, which will provide better clearance for larger computers like a Garmin Edge 1000 or a similar large computer. And basically the installation process is essentially the same as the installation process for the faceplate. You just remove the faceplate bolts, reinstall them, and then torque everything back up to 5 Newton meters. You can see that installing this in the lower position would position my computer in line with my stem and handlebars. It's nicely positioned there. Installing it up here gets it a little bit closer to you and also allows you to install a larger computer. We're really excited for you guys to get your shock stops. If you have any questions once you start installing or riding with your shock stop, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us at support@redshiftssports.com, or you can submit a contact request through our website at www.redshiftssports.com.